Cities are the crucible of civilization. They have been expanding. Urbanization has been expanding at an exponential rate in the last 200 years, so that by the second part of this century, the planet will be completely dominated by cities. Cities are the origins of global warming, impact on the environment, health, pollution, disease, finance, economies, energy, are all problems that are confronted by having cities. That's where all these problems come from. And the tsunami of problems that we feel we're facing in terms of sustainability questions are actually a reflection of the exponential increase in urbanization across the planet. Here's some numbers. 200 years ago, the United States was less than a few percent urbanized. It's now more than 82%. The planet has crossed the halfway mark a few years ago. China's building 300 new cities in the next 20 years. Now listen to this. Every week for the foreseeable future, until 2050, every week more than 1 million people are being added to our cities. This is going to affect everything. Everybody in this room, if you stay alive, is going to be affected by what's happening in cities and this extraordinary phenomenon. However, cities, despite having this kind of negative aspect to them, are also the solution, because cities are the vacuum cleaners, the magnets that have sucked up creative people, creating ideas, innovation, wealth, and so on. So we have this kind of dual nature. And so here's the problem. This is what we all want. The 10 billion people on the planet in 2050 want to live in places like this, having things like this, doing things like this, with economies that are growing like this, not realizing that entropy produces things like this, 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 and this. And the question is that what Edinburgh and London and New York are going to look like in 2050, or is it going to be this? That's the question. I must say, many of the indicators look like this is what it's going to look like, but let's talk Lastly, about it. I want to talk about growth. This is what we had in biology, just to repeat. Economies of scale gave rise to this kind of sigmoidal behavior. You grow fast and then stop. It's part of our resilience. That would be bad for economies and cities. And indeed, one of the wonderful things about the theory is that if you have superlinear scaling from wealth creation and innovation, then indeed you get, from the same theory, beautiful rising exponential curve, lovely, and in fact, if you compare it to data, it fits very well with the development of cities and economies. But it has a terrible catch. And the catch is that this system is destined to collapse. And it's destined to collapse for many reasons, kind of Malthusian reasons, that you run out of resources. And how do you avoid that? Well, we've done it before. What we do is, as we grow and we approach the collapse, a major innovation takes place, and we start over again. And we start over again as we approach the next one, and so on. So there's this continuous cycles of innovation that is necessary in order to sustain growth and avoid collapse. The catch, however, to this is that you have to innovate faster and faster and faster. So the image is that we're not only on a treadmill that's going faster, but we have to change the treadmill faster and faster. We have to accelerate on a continuous basis. And the question is, can we, as socioeconomic beings, avoid a half?
The threat of global warming means that developed nations now need to act decisively to reduce the carbon footprint of their economies. Low and zero carbon technologies in homes, in cities, and at national level are a key part of the long-term solution to climate change. In this video, we'll look at initiatives in London that promise a cleaner, more sustainable energy supply, and we'll consider the potential for realizing a zero carbon future.
The world's cities are responsible for 70% of the world's CO2 emissions. They are most at risk from climate change. They're the ones causing climate change, and they're the ones best placed to tackle climate change.
What climate change does is give us a really big wake-up call that means that we should really get real about renewable energy and sustainable energy policy in this country, and let's understand the scale of action we need now.
London consumes as much energy annually as Greece. If the city can radically reduce its carbon emissions, it will set an example for urban environments across the world.
As one of the world's leading cities, people note what we do here in the capital. And if London is able to show that it's possible to have a low carbon or even a zero carbon future, then other cities around the world, and indeed maybe governments, will recognise that this isn't a fantasy, this is possible. It's possible to have a successful economy, a vibrant city, and yet be low carbon.
London's infrastructure has to think about the efficiency of energy really from the top to the bottom. 80% of London's carbon footprint comes from buildings, so therefore buildings need to be a real hotspot.
Strategic planning measures have been introduced to try to ensure that new buildings in London are designed and constructed in the most sustainable way.
The developers that get in now and build up a reputation for being able to deliver low and zero carbon developments are going to do extremely well in the coming years. Those that don't recognise that that's the way that the market's going are going to get rapidly left behind. The only new developments that are going to happen in London where the mayor has any power over them are going to be low and zero carbon developments. We are simply not going to allow anything else to be built in London of any scale.
It's now widely recognised that integrating renewable technologies into the urban environment can play an important role in reducing carbon emissions. A number of groundbreaking projects are setting the standard for a sustainable energy future in London. Dagenham is home to London's first major wind park. These turbines generate enough energy to power 1,200 homes.
In the future, there's a number of offshore wind farms going through the planning stage. One of those will be the largest wind farm in the world at 1,000 megawatts, which is about equal to a quarter of London's energy demand.
Transport for London hopes to acquire 20% of its electricity from renewables and has encouraged the use of solar power by investing in photovoltaic installations such as this one at Vauxhall Cross Interchange.
We're also trialling lots of new clean fuel technologies. The most obvious one is our wonderful fuel cell buses, of which we have 3, which simply emit steam, look like a kind of, almost like a steam train as they go around London, but it's just pure water vapour that's coming out of the top.
Public perceptions also need to be addressed to encourage changes in individuals' attitudes and behaviour that will help reduce carbon emissions.
Public perception has been totally central to changing governments' attitudes around the world to climate change. It's incredible in our own polling. 95% of Londoners recognise that climate change is a problem, and it ranks as one of the 4 or 5 things that they're most concerned about. A zero carbon future is the only future that we can try and build, because if we don't try and have a zero carbon future, then we're going to be living on a planet that's very difficult for large numbers of the current human population to survive in. And we have to recognise that a zero carbon future is a positive future. It's not something where we're going to have to reduce quality of life, standard of living for people. It's one where people's quality of life will improve.
Climate change is already a heavy topic, and it's getting heavier because we're understanding that we need to do more than we are, right? We're understanding, in fact, that those of us who live in the developed world need to be really pushing towards eliminating our emissions. That's, to put it mildly, not what's on the table now. And it tends to feel a little overwhelming when we look at what is there in reality today and the magnitude of the problem that we face. And when we have overwhelming problems in front of us, we tend to seek simple answers. And I think this is what we've done with climate change. We look at where the emissions are coming from. They're coming out of our tailpipes and smokestacks and so forth. And we say, okay, well, the problem is that they're coming out of fossil fuels that we're burning. So therefore, the answer must be to replace those fossil fuels with clean sources of energy. And while, of course, we do need clean energy, I would put to you that it's possible that by looking at climate change as a clean energy generation problem, we're in fact setting ourselves up not to solve it. And the reason why is that we live on a planet that is rapidly urbanizing. That shouldn't be news to any of us. However, it's hard sometimes to remember the extent of that urbanization. By mid-century, we're going to have about 8 billion, perhaps more, people living in cities or within a day's travel of one. We will be an overwhelmingly urban species. in order to provide the kind of energy that it would take for 8 billion people living in cities that are even somewhat like the cities that those of us in the global north live in today, we would have to generate an absolutely astonishing amount of energy. It may be possible that we are not even able to build that much clean energy, right? So if we're seriously talking about tackling climate change on an urbanizing planet, we need to look somewhere else for the solution. The solution, in fact, may be closer to hand than we think, because all of those cities we're building are opportunities. Every city determines, to a very large extent, the amount of energy used by its inhabitants. Right? We tend to think of energy use as a behavioral thing. I choose to turn this light switch on. But really, enormous amounts of our energy use are sort of predestined by the kinds of communities and cities that we live in. I won't show you very many graphs today, but if I can just focus on this one for a moment, it really tells us a lot of what we need to know, which is quite simply that if you look, for example, at transportation, a major category of climate emissions, there's a direct relationship between how dense a city is and the amount of climate emissions that its residents spew out into the air. And the correlation, of course, is that denser places tend to have lower emissions. It is possible, of course, to increase the density of the communities around us. Some places are doing this with new eco-districts, developing whole new sustainable neighborhoods, which is nice work if you can get it. But most of the time, what we're talking about is, in fact, reweaving the urban fabric that we already have. So we're talking about things like infill development, really sharp little changes to where we have buildings, where we're developing, urban retrofitting, creating different sorts of spaces and uses out of places that are already there. Increasingly, we're realizing that we don't even need to densify an entire city. What we need instead is an average density that rises to a level where we don't drive as much and so on. And that can be done by raising the density in very specific spots a whole lot. Right? So you could think of it as tent poles that actually raise the density of the entire city. And we find that when we do that, we can in fact have a few places that are really hyperdense within a wider fabric of places that are perhaps a little more comfortable and achieve the same results. Now, we may find that there are places that are really, really dense and still hold on to their cars. But the reality is that, by and large, what we see when we get a lot of people together with the right conditions is a threshold effect, where people simply stop driving as much, and increasingly more and more people, if they're surrounded by places that make them feel at home, give up their cars altogether. And this is a huge, huge energy savings, because what comes out of our tailpipe is really just, the beginning of the story with climate emissions from cars. We have the manufacture of the car, the disposal of the car, all of the parking and freeways and so on. When you can get rid of all of those, because somebody doesn't use any of them really, you find that you can actually cut transportation emissions as much as 90%. And people are embracing this. All around the world, we're seeing more and more people embrace this sort of walk are becoming life. Bundles of services, right? So we have new designs that are helping us take mechanical things that we used to spend energy on, like heating, cooling, et cetera, and turn them into things that we avoid spending energy on. So we light our buildings with daylight. We cool them with breezes. We heat them with sunshine. In fact, when we use all these things, what we found is that in some cases, energy use in a building can drop as much as 90%, which brings on another threshold effect I like to call furnace dumping, which is quite simply, if you have a building that doesn't need to be heated with a furnace, you save a whole bunch of money up front. These things actually become cheaper to build than the alternatives. In cities, we need to think a little differently. This is one way to do it. This is Vancouver's propaganda about how green a city they are. And certainly lots of people have taken to heart this idea that a sustainable city is covered in greenery. So we have visions like this, we have visions like this, we have visions like this. Now, all of these are fine projects, but they really have kind of missed an essential point, which is it's not about the leaves above, it's about the systems below. Do they, for instance, capture rainwater so that we can reduce water use? Water is energy intensive. Do they perhaps include green infrastructure so that we can take runoff and water that's going out of our houses and clean it and filter it and grow?
Oxford is a constantly moving city that embraces both its foundations and new advances in technological innovations. With movement comes energy consumption and rising carbon emissions, or at least that's what we used to believe. OxFutures is a new initiative that is spearheading the charge for change in the way that we create, use and save energy. It represents a unique collaboration between the European Union, Oxford City Council, Oxfordshire County Council and the Low Carbon Hub. Now wheels are in motion for a greener, more energy efficient Oxfordshire.
It's all about making sure that we have renewable energy and we use less energy in Oxford with the support of the European Union, and I think it's a great way to tackle climate change. Oxford has taken a very strong line on playing our part in tackling climate change, going for renewable energy and trying to reduce the amount of energy that we use each year.
Getting that investment in is going to be fantastic for the local economy because it means jobs, it means less money spent on energy bills, and it means developing new businesses based on innovation that the two universities produce.
I think all of us must make sure that we live in energy efficient homes. So if you've got a landlord and he hasn't insulated the loft, make sure he insulates the loft. We must all use our bicycles as much as possible and our cars as little as possible. We always have to ask, do we really need to make this aeroplane journey? Because that can be very damaging to the environment too. So everybody's life matters, and it really does make a difference. It's no good just saying, oh, it's only me, it won't matter. But it's millions and billions of me's around the planet that will stop the world overheating if we act in the right way.
Look forward to a brighter, greener future with OxFutures.
For years, we've been told that we cannot pursue strong economic growth and combat climate change at the same time. But what if that's a false choice? Around the world, countries, cities and businesses are demonstrating that we can have better living standards and new jobs and a safer climate. We can design better cities, compact and connected cities, with better urban planning and transport systems. We could save $3 trillion over the next 15 years if we build our cities in a smart way. That would create better places to live in and produce less carbon pollution than causes climate change. Most fast-growing economies can already achieve more than a quarter of their new energy needs from renewable sources. And the best part? The investments needed to shift to a low-carbon economy are almost the same as those investments we'll make anyway. Today's technological advances are already creating opportunities for employment and economic growth while reducing climate risks. And if government leaders pursue smart policies, they will accelerate these changes. These are the findings of the new Climate Economy Report from a team of world-class economic experts, heads of government and business leaders. We don't have to choose. We can have a safe climate and a prosperous future.